I'm Sister Helen Prejean, and I'm really delighted to be able to speak to you on this 20th anniversary of the last execution in Europe. Europe and the United States have always had connections with each other, and when Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman were working to end slavery in the U.S., one of the first universities that asked them to speak was University of Glasgow in Scotland. And incidentally, it's the first place that ever gave me an honorary degree was in Glasgow. Europe and the United States we came up together. We branched off from you. And human rights is providing the common road that enables us all in the global community to walk together. Before the UN Declaration of Universal Human Rights, most countries had the death penalty. In 1948, though, with the UN Declaration, where Eleanor Roosevelt played a role in that, it was the first time we had a statement of inalienable human rights for every human being simply because they're a human being, inalienable. And of course, embedded in that, Article 3 and Article 5, Article 3, everyone has a right to life. And then in Article 5, no one should be subjected to cruel and degrading punishment or torture. Now, it's translating that in life and not recognizing it for what it is that has enabled us to kill people, torture people, imprison people unmercifully for long periods. We have done many cruel things to each other. And it's how to interpret human rights. In this case, no matter what evil someone has done. And integral in that is what is the role of government or states in deciding who should live and who should die. So we've been in this together. The role of NGOs has been extremely important because and I'm going to give you through my experience right away, as soon as I became awake to the death penalty in Louisiana, one of the 10 southern states in the U.S. that does 70% of all actual executions. You always can see the relationship between race and poverty. The slave states, the ex-slave states are the ones that practice most of the executions. All have the same words in the Constitution. And the NGOs have been vital in my formation and everybody's formation. So one of my first teachers was Amnesty International. And they were the ones who taught me. They had a campaign in 1989 about what human rights inalienable means. So the rights are so deep in us simply because you're a human being that governments don't give human rights for good behavior and they can't take it away for bad behavior. My journey, which I think in some way mirrors every person's journey that becomes awake and then impassioned and committed to end the death penalty, has to do with encountering in some way the suffering of people on death row. The rhetoric you hear is, well, look at the crime they did. Most horrendous, unspeakable crimes. We reserve the death penalty just for them. But then what Amnesty taught me was when you put government in charge of deciding who these people are, it's always and invariably going to be the poorest people and the ones who are most despised in society. Prejudice comes in, and we see that with the death penalty in the U.S. So I'm like many citizens in the U.S., unawake about the death penalty and most social justice things because I had a life of privilege. My mother and father had an intact family. My daddy was a successful lawyer. I never questioned the Jim Crow laws, the segregation, much less the death penalty. I simply accepted that when people did really terrible crimes, that society had to protect the rest of us from them, and so it just seemed right. They killed, we kill them. So then what changed in my life was when I made a move and began to live among poor people in New Orleans and began to see life in the United States from a whole other point of view of being black and it being the object of prejudice, and noticing how our prisons and jails were filled with black people, much more so than white people. So I began to learn. And then I wrote a letter to a man on death row. His name is Patrick Saunier. He wrote back. Then I began to visit him, and I ended up being with him when he was killed in the electric chair in the early morning hours of April 5th, 1984. And that gave rise to this book, Dead Man Walking. And I wrote about it as I got to know this man and visited him, and truly he had done an unspeakable crime. With his brother, they had killed 2 innocent teenage kids. But I got to know him as a person. I began to see that the humanness and the dignity of people, that everybody's worth more than the worst thing they've ever done. That can't contain who a human being is. And I'm writing a book now about it's the prequel to Dead Man Walking, the spiritual journey that brought me there. And one of I do in the prelude of this book, and it was about Pat Saunier's execution that really changed my life, witnessing it. They killed a man with fire one night, strapped him to a wooden chair, and pumped electricity through his body until he was dead. His killing was a legal act because he had killed. No religious leaders protested the killing that night, but I was there. I saw it with my own eyes. And what I saw set my soul on fire, a fire that burns in me still. And now here's an account of how I came to be in the killing chamber that night and the currents that brought me there. Coming out after that execution, having seen the cruelty of it, having seen that he was a human being, having seen give him years in prison, but that he was capable of transforming his life. One act can never define a human being. And so then conscience rose up inside me. And it was at that moment outside the prison gates, the night of that execution, that I knew what I had to do, that I needed to devote my life to waking up my fellow citizens about the death penalty and that we needed to abolish it. And my story is no different from a lot of people I have met who are committed to human rights. Something sparked, like, no, this is wrong, and I must actively engage in resisting it and changing it. So after Pat Saunier, I accompanied others to execution as well. And I'd like to talk in particular about a case in Oklahoma that's happening now, a man by the name of Richard Glossop. Because this story of Richard Glossop shows how you have individual conscience that gets in there. You have the NGOs and the people that work in these human rights groups who come together. And social media comes together. And it's a convergence of forces that can help save a life. Richard Glossop kept telling everybody he had been in prison 16 years on death row in Oklahoma, that he was innocent. Nobody believed him. He couldn't get anybody to listen to him. And then when it happened, finally I heard about it. They sent me a letter and just said, would you please get on board with Richard Glossop? He's innocent. They arranged a phone call with Richard, and I heard his voice. And he said, Sister Helen, I hope you don't mind. I'm really sorry I didn't ask your permission, but I did put you down to be with the witnesses when I'm executed. Would you do that for me? So when I climbed into bed that night after that conversation, I remember I bolted awake and thought, there's no way, even suspecting that he's innocent, that I can just let that man be executed. I'll witness it, then I'll make a statement afterwards about how wrong it is. And so I got involved. Right away I called Susan Sarandon, She's in Dead Man Walking in the film, and she's deeply committed to human rights. And I said, Susan, there's this man. I've met this man. Will you join me? And she did. She got in both feet, and we started getting petitions signed. We started getting the word out on TV. The role in media is really important. And Susan was right in there, because you got to begin to get the word out. And then one of the first lessons I had learned from Amnesty, first thing is create doubt. Everybody's sure of this. Oh yeah, of course he's guilty. They all say that around us. And so went to Oklahoma to join this little grassroots coalition, Oklahomans Against the Death Penalty. And we had a press conference. And what we did in the press conference was we started bringing out all the questions about Richard's innocence that never got a chance in the courtroom for the jury to hear. And we began the campaign then, summoned in good lawyers, donating their services, giving their services free of charge, to try to look at that case and see where the Constitution, the rights in the Constitution of Richard Glossop had been abused. And so we began, and the movement built. I want to say the group that I primarily belong to, I belong to a number of NGOs, is I'm a sister of St. Joseph. I'm a religious Catholic nun. And we have a group called Ministry Against the Death Penalty. But we have, as part of our staff, Rose Vines and Griffin Hardy, who are on our social media team. And they began, through social media, to get out about Richard Glossop. Before it was all over, we had tabulated that 300 million people in the world had heard about Richard Glossop. And what it did was it spotlighted what Oklahoma had been doing, all the injustices, the innocent people thrown in with the guilty. So Richard's life was spared. He's still waiting for the final verdict. But then suddenly the world began to look at this so-called perfect scheme of justice that can be carried out. So I just want to say to you who are gathering here in the Council of Europe, how important you are and how important Europe is, how important every group of conscious individuals who become aware that something's wrong in the world has a of conscience must work to end it. I'm glad to be collaborating with you in this way. And one final thing about the role of religion and the death penalty. The Catholic Church had always upheld that the state has a right to take life. And you have a long history going back here as things evolved. So when I came on the scene in the 80s with Pat Saunier, our Archbishop in New Orleans was good friends with Harry Connick, who was the DA. And the Archbishop would send a letter that Harry Connick would read at the trials when people were up for the death penalty. And the letter said from the Archbishop that Catholics in good conscience could vote for death. And so through a number of just events that happened, I got to have a conversation with Pope John Paul II. And I said to him, Your Holiness, does the Catholic Church only uphold the dignity of innocent life? Well, when I'm walking with a man to execution and he's bound hand and foot, surrounded by guards, and they're taking him to his death, and he turns toward me and he says, Sister, please pray that God holds up my legs. Where's the dignity in this death? Is this self-defense of society? We can be defended by a prison term, people that are very violent. Please do something to help our church strengthen our position against the death penalty, that people have an inalienable right to life, and it's part of their dignity as a child of God. And Pope John Paul did, and now we have our wonderful Pope Francis now, who's bringing it much further. All of us together in the global community work together to help human rights to come. And I appreciate you're letting me parachute in on your meeting here and greet all of you. Keep up the good work.